Hi everyone, and welcome to today's expert panel discussion, asking, are we losing the fight against extremism in the UK? I'm Lizzie Dearden, the independent security correspondent, and I will be moderating today's discussion convened by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Before coronavirus, there was concern that extremist ideas were becoming part of the mainstream. Last year, we saw both main political parties rocked by accusations of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. We also saw teachers receive death threats for introducing LGBT equalities content in Birmingham. And now we're seeing an unprecedented rise in conspiracy theories relating to vaccinations and large protests taking place in London and other cities. Hate crime, hate speech, and anti-establishment sentiment seem to be spreading. Are these risk factors eroding social cohesion? Are they deepening divisions during a period of already heightened economic and social vulnerability? Europe has already seen a spate of Islamist terror attacks in recent weeks, and while ISIS-inspired atrocities remain the greatest risk according to police, the threat from far-right and other forms of extremism is growing. And on Sunday in the UK, we passed the anniversary of the Fishmongers Hall terror attack, an attack carried out by a released terrorist prisoner who was under monitoring by several authorities and was known or thought to be a de-radicalised example of the system working at its best. So we have deep question marks in the UK about the future of integration policy, counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. We have an independent review of Prevent that's been promised by the government, but has not yet been started amid continued controversy about the scheme. And the main question is, what extent are extremist views now making it into the mainstream? And what can be the UK's strategy against ideas that drive division and could lead to violence? So I'm pleased to welcome our four expert speakers who are going to be helping us to find some answers today. We have Richard Walton, who is a senior fellow at the Policy Exchange and the former head of the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Command. We have Imam Dr. Osama Hassan, who has been delayed, but we're hoping that he'll be able to join us shortly. He's a research consultant at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, as is his colleague Christina Ariza, and she is an analyst who can specialise in far-right extremism. And we also have Matthew Feldman, the director for the Centre for the Analysis of the Radical Right. Unfortunately, we have just an hour with our experts today, so we'll be taking as many questions as we can from the audience later. And if you'd like to put them in the Q&A section, which can be found with the button at the bottom of your screen, hopefully we'll answer as many of those questions as we can later. So I'm going to start by opening the discussion with some questions to our panel. And first we will go to Christina. So when we talk about non-violent extremism and mainstreaming, what do we mean by that, and what are the main concerns at the moment?
Thank you, Lizzie, so much. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to thank you for being our moderator, as well to the rest of the panelists today. We're very looking forward to this discussion. On your question, when we talk about the mainstreaming of extremism, I think it's important to understand what do we mean when we talk about extremism, which is a bit of the million-dollar question. But yet extremism seems to be somewhat of a spectrum. We do usually refer to violent extremism when we're talking in the context of terrorism. So obviously, a lot of the issues that you mentioned, Lizzie, counter-terror prosecutions, terror attacks that we've seen in past months and a year ago just at Fishmonger Hall, all that is part and parcel of the harder end of this extremism problem. And obviously, it has to be a priority for the government to counter that because it's contributing to loss of life. But yet, terrorism is only, if anything, is obviously the most visible part, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. We still have other manifestations of extremism that are sometimes violent, but not necessarily so. We know that some groups, for example, in the far right have engaged in harassment of people of Muslim faith, but journalists as well, as you very well know, Lizzie, as well as intimidatory tactics and entering mosques and sort of targeting the staff. You mentioned in your introductory remarks how we saw in the Birmingham debate how there was trying to be some provocation and some intimidation for teachers trying to introduce LGBT content into the curriculum. And as well, when we think about our political discourse, we also see influence of extremism there, with the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that have really coarsened our political discourse. So really here, the fear with this is that this is providing an environment that where these acts of violence can potentially emerge, but that is in itself is also threatening social cohesion. So this is a question that we at the Tony Blair Institute have been asking ourselves for quite some time now. And we wanted to understand what was the extent of this idea. So not only what is extremism, what does it mean, but how far reaching is it? And really how influential is it with people in the UK today? So last year, in partnership with Savanta Commerce, we carried out a nationwide survey of 2,000 young people from both Muslim and white backgrounds. And we asked them questions about extreme views, their views on counter-extremism, and other issues such as whether they feel discriminated, what they think about integration, views of the government, and so on. So from this research, really, we have some good news and some bad news. The emerging sort of view is that majority of people do not agree with extreme views. It's about an 80% who really do not find any resonance in these ideas. But yet, however, there is a significant minority, which is a 20% at worst for some of the narratives, of people who actually are finding a bit of sympathy in these extreme statements. So, but however, there's a bit of a scale when we look at these views. If we think about extremism in terms of white nationalism and white supremacy, only 6% of white young people in the UK think that the UK should be a country for all whites only, or that you're not truly British unless you're white. But however, if you take this to anti-Muslim views, however, around 30% think that Islam is a violent religion and that there are no-go zones in the UK where Sharia law dominates. As well, we have around 1 in 5 of young Muslims who think that there is an unresolvable conflict between Islam and the West. And yet we also have around 1 in 5 of both samples who think that democracy is broken, that we should replace it, and that we have to boycott the government. So what this is telling us really is that there is some elements of the extremist worldview, aside from violence, which in our sample was around 1 in 10 agreeing or sympathizing with violent statements, of individuals who sort of see a bit of resonance in these non-violent expressions of extremism. And that is something that definitely should not just be looked at in terms of only law enforcement, but it's a whole of society approach that we need to think about. I'm going to wrap it up here and waiting for your questions later. Thank you, Lizzie.
Great, thank you very much. So now we will move on to Osama, who's been able to join us. Thank you. So at the moment, what do you make of the threat of Islamist extremism to the UK? With the fall of ISIS, there was hope that its ideology would hold less sway, but we've seen this recent spate of ISIS-inspired attacks in Europe, and we've also had 4 Islamist terror attacks in the UK in the past year alone. What do you think the current situation is, and is there a way of telling what direction we're travelling in?
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie, and everyone. So on that question, I think we need to keep monitoring the situation, basically. As you said, I think many of the ideas of Islamism or Islamist extremism were discredited by ISIS and by the fall of ISIS. In fact, for many years, those of us working in this field have been warning about precisely the type of group like ISIS would emerge, based on these very extreme ideas of a rejection of democracy, of modern world, of so-called Western values, and pitting Islamic values against Western values, whereas really it's very easy. There are millions of Western Muslims who feel comfortable with both titles, and there's a strong sense, increasing sense in the Muslim world of universal values and how Muslims and Islam would share with other civilizations and religions, or should share, in the building of our common humanity. Now, we did see a reduction in referrals to ISIS, to PREVENT. For example, we saw a massive reduction in people trying to travel to Syria to join ISIS as soon as their military defeat started stacking up. and also after their atrocities, which were widely broadcast. Of course, there was much revulsion within Muslim communities in Britain who may have had sympathies for some Islamist ideas, but I certainly picked that up from talking to people, including within prison, actually. You know, there was a time, I know people who were terrorist convicts in British prisons who wore it as a badge of honor almost, or certainly other prisoners regarded it as something to be respected, because as people who work with prisoners know, there's often a pecking order in prison in terms of the severity of your crime and the kind of respect you get. And there was a time, certainly in the 90s, late 90s, but in the noughties after 9/11, where Islamist terrorist convicts would be regarded with a lot of respect, as though, you know, they're the really tough guys, the hard guys. Whereas recently, some of the cases I worked with, young men in prison, that sympathy had gone completely. You know, those who were convicted as Islamist terrorists or of joining ISIS type groups, they were given very short shrift by other Muslim prisoners who didn't want to go near them, actually. So I think there have been some very positive signs there. However, the number of prevent referrals that you've just seen were published last week. And for the first time in about 3 or 4 years, the number of Islamist referrals has just risen slightly, not a huge amount. But what I think is happening is that the Islamist extremism networks and ideas in this country, you know, have been formed over the last 30 or 40 years. There's a lot of momentum behind all of that. And that will take time to fizzle out. You know, I'm very hopeful it will fizzle out. We're seeing far more integration within Muslim communities. We're seeing far more diversity within British Muslim communities. So not all kind of joining Islamist bandwagons, as was the case a couple of decades ago when the Islamists were the only major voice, if you like, in public. Now there are a lot more diverse voices, but equally the Islamist networks have a momentum behind them. And for example, I'll give you one example which shows a nuance which also Christina was referring to, is that another report from the Tony Blair Institute a couple of years ago mapped how different Islamist groups were changing their rhetoric and their messaging. And one notable conclusion, you know, backed up by data, was that the group called MEND, which was very close to Cage, and in fact its director had funded Cage largely, but MEND had begun to move away from Islamist messaging and toward more pro-integration, kind of pro-British messages, if you like. Now there's still work to be done there, whereas many of us see Cage as still a problematic organization. You know, MEND seem to be trying to move away from that. But recently, of course, it's not easy for the whole of society, especially when people come at it into this field from different stages, to kind of be on the same page. So, for example, as was referred to recently, the Civil Service Muslim Network actually put out an invitation to the founder of MEND to speak, and then that invitation was cancelled by intervention of more senior civil servants, presumably. Now, you know, that invitation, it kind of depends on which direction MEND is going. Is it a force for good and for integration, or is it closer to the old days of being close to Cage? So now, obviously, it's kind of in between. It's a bit tricky, as the Institute report showed. So should they be addressing Muslim civil servants or not? These are some of the wider questions around Islamism and Islamist ideas, which are also being brought up by events across Europe. As you mentioned, those ISIS-inspired attacks, the whole discussion in France and Austria and other places around Islamism especially, obviously is highly contested, especially with France, with their very kind of radical secularism. But I think those debates are crucial and do spill over into Britain. So for example, when Macron asks Muslims to accept Islam as a religion only and not a political movement, you know, he's asking a question which goes to the core of religion and politics, Islam and Islamism. And those debates are being had quite vigorously in the British Muslim scene, I think more so than across Europe. And I think, you know, Britain does things through multiculturalism, which often in France is not acceptable, really, or they're not as multicultural in the way Britain is. So all of these ideas and dynamics are being played out at the moment, I think. But clearly a threat is still there. The number of prevent referrals, the number of Islamist attacks that you mentioned recently are still there, because the old ideas which had several decades of momentum behind them and the networks and everything are still very potent and very dangerous. And of course, the conflicts continue around the world. ISIS has been defeated in Iraq and Syria, but there are pro-ISIS and Al-Qaeda groups, all over Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, etc. And they keep trying to send fighters to Europe as well. So, the threat is still there, and we need to monitor the things carefully, but also look at the dynamics of some of the positive steps that are happening, which I tried to allude to there. I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of things to take into the debate there, I'm sure. So, Matthew, is there anything you can tell us about the current threat from the far right in the UK? We've heard a number of times from the head of UK counter-terror policing that the far right is what he calls the fastest growing threat, although they are clear that it's a less threat kind of numerically in terms of their caseload than Islamism. So can you give us any insight about what's happening there and any current changes or trends?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. I mean, I certainly think that the word change is really the important one. I ask people maybe just to think back 10, 12 years ago, really, in this country when the BNP had, around 10,000 members. They were just on the verge of getting 2 MEPs. That was a radical right party, but it was doing it in the traditional way. Cut that time in half, of course, and the radical right or far right in this country has changed dramatically. You're looking at defense leagues in all the countries, of course, led by the English Defense League, some split off movements that were even more extreme, like the Infidels and the Pie and Mash Squad. And we come up to more recently, and Lizzie, you're absolutely right. I think that the probably, numerically, it might be smaller than other forms of extremism, but we heard some discussion of the recent reports by Prevent and by the Channel program, and fully 43% of the Deradicalisation Channel program is made up of far-right extremists for 2019, 2020, and it's nearly half of the Prevent program. And that number has been growing year on year. And I think just as a very brief sort of snapshot of this period of real change. And of course, when the BNP was the sort of a big radical right group on the block, that didn't stop there being neo-Nazi or much more extreme groups. And just like today, we're seeing a turn towards smaller, younger, more extreme groups. That doesn't stop groups like For Britain or the Patriotic Alternative really trying to occupy that radical right space. So I think that how we define it and how we look at it is crucial. But I suppose maybe I just end this sort of initial thought by saying we're looking at a period of real flux. It looks like the numbers might be smaller, but more extreme. And that what we see increasingly is far-right extremists and some moving into the terroristic space that are global in inspiration, really not stopping, obviously, like the internet doesn't stop at national borders, but are local in action. And I think that global in inspiration, local in action is a dynamic that we don't see necessarily ceasing anytime soon.
Okay, excellent. And moving on finally to Richard, from your view, how well is the government's response to extremism and terrorism doing? On the one hand, the government will frequently say that we have a world-leading counter-terrorism machine, but on the other hand, they don't talk that specifically about extremism as an issue. And of course, we have seen, I believe, a dozen terror attacks since 2017. So how are things working for you? And are there any areas that you think authorities should be looking at the moment?
Well, thank you, Lizzie, and thank you to the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change for hosting this debate. Your question is about the government's response to extremism and terrorism, and I want to address extremism and terrorism separately because they're obviously different and need to be approached differently. And obviously, with my background, I'll be describing the response from a rule of law perspective, as it were. So if I start with the response to the serious end of the trajectory, terrorism, I do believe that the UK is best in class globally still, and we are indeed world leading with our contest strategy. We've got over 150 years of experience of dealing with terrorist threats of all kinds, and the Met's first counter-terrorism unit was started in the last century against the Irish terrorist threats, and has developed world-class experience and expertise over the decades since, both in investigative techniques and in running covert proactive intelligence-led operations, and as we know, leading to high numbers of convictions of terrorists. I mean, the sheer number of attack plots disrupted is a testament to the success of the model, and is now, you know, it's a seamless endeavour between the intelligence agencies and our police, who are the envy of the world. But just last week, the security minister informed us that 27 terrorist plots have been foiled by UK police and security services since March 2017. That's one plot every 6 weeks, approximately. And we really need to be shocked by that. The majority from Islamist terrorists, but also 8 of those 27 from far-right individuals. So occasionally attacks have succeeded, with many innocent people murdered, as we saw in 2005 with 7/7, and more recently in 2017 and since, with a number of attacks, such as the Manchester bombing attack. And of particular note is that we now have had 25 years of Islamist attack plots. And I remember when the Islamist threat first evolved at Scotland Yard. I mean, you know, we had, as recently as in the 1990s, we had only a desk full of officers dealing with international threats, which included all Islamist threats. So Islamist terrorism currently accounts for 90% of all terrorist threat in the UK, with the other 10% accounted for by Irish far right and some minor number of far left threats too. And the governments of all persuasions, in fact, and indeed prime ministers of all parties, in particular Tony Blair and David Cameron, have taken the right decisions and invested heavily in the police and intelligence agencies over this period, who are now extremely well resourced and equipped. So in terms of dealing with terrorism, proactively and reactively, we are world class. But of course, that is only part of the story. And the real question we need to ask ourselves is why we have this level of terrorism threat in the first place. And let's remind ourselves that 73% of all those convicted of terrorism across Europe were nationals of their own countries. And that's approaching 60% of all those convicted in this country were British-born, British-educated nationals here. So now let's just talk briefly about extremism, if I may, and what I'd call the fuel or supply line of terrorism. I think our government's response over the past 25 years or so has been quite different. It's been incoherent, inconsistent, and frankly constrained by politics. We're failing to call out extremists of all persuasions, of all kinds. Some politicians have often been too reluctant to call out Islamist extremists in particular, because they worry about being labelled as Islamophobic, making extremist Islamic political groups that use these labels stronger and more confident. We're consistently, I believe, underplaying the role of ideology and theology, and also, again, particularly in Islamist extremism. Sajid Javid over the weekend referred to this in his article as talking obliquely about some of these subjects, and I endorse that view. And we explain away the terrorist threat by reference to sociological factors without acknowledging that terrorism is a choice, and one chosen by individuals that subscribe to a particular ideology. Because some don't want to offend, and often we don't want to offend, all of us feel that, we don't want to even use the word terrorism anymore, and we're starting to use other more euphemistic terms. And there's sometimes a reluctance to call out new forms of extremism, perhaps environmental extremism that supports mass law breaking, because we support the cause. But in effect, by doing that, by not calling it out, we're condoning extremism, in my view. We allow apologists for terror to talk unchallenged about the human rights of terrorists when we rarely talk about the human rights of the population, the right to life, and the right to live without the fear of terrorism and the terrorism threat. So counter-extremism is dealt with in government silos with separate units in health, education, justice, local government, all working independently with, frankly, insufficient collaboration between those units. We're not investing in teaching sufficiently and robustly our nation's values to our children to counter the ideologies that underpin terrorism. It's interesting that only a day or so ago, I think it was Macron, something you might want to talk about, is introduced a charter of Republican values into France, trying to address the recent challenges that they're facing over there. So I think, just to conclude my section, Lizzie, I think we need a new focus. I think we need a new, bold, cross-government counter-extremism strategy. It's not particularly new laws we need, but new policy and the will to execute it. And if we don't move quickly, frankly, I think extremism will continue to grow as it has been doing, and fueled by social media as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess the biggest story of the past year, the biggest changes to our lives has been coronavirus. And at the start of that pandemic, there was concern raised by counterterrorism police, people working in Prevent and other counter-extremism agencies, that it could provide what they called a perfect storm for extremism with the increased amount of time people were spending online. And I wanted to ask you, Christina, whether there is any indication that coronavirus has had the effect feared on extremism in the UK, or whether it's having any other kind of impact that we should be aware of going forward when the pandemic ends.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think with a lot of these things, the data is too early to tell, which is a frank answer, but there are things that we know now, which is with COVID-19, extremist groups have seen an opportunity to rally. And this has been in terms of far-right groups demonizing Muslims and accusing them of spreading the virus when the first lockdown was coming around. It has come also in the way of conspiracy theories, particularly anti-vaxxers seeing quite a resurgence naturally linked to the health crisis. We've also seen QAnon conspiracy theories that were born in the US now popping up at anti-lockdown and anti-vaxxer protests in London. And at the same time, we've also seen how groups are very acutely aware that they can use the pandemic not only to push their rhetoric or their conspiracies, but also to portray themselves as, you know, the saviors helping their communities and feeding the homeless and taking food to asylums and so on. So definitely there's evidence already of groups really seeing this as an opportunity and seizing it. But at the same time, we also know, and this is the warning that you were mentioning, that a lot of push factors of what experts on radicalization have been warning about, disenfranchisement, isolation, unemployment, lack of prospects, a lot of that, and even personal trauma, a lot of that is at play now. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that there's a causal relationship and that that's going to lead to increase in radicalization. But it's also very obvious that Prevent, obviously with lockdowns happening, people spending more time online, a lot of our safeguarding defenses are not working as they were, and as we all adapt to this new reality. I think I would probably issue a bit of caution when we talk about radicalization online, because what we know from the radicalization process is that this is a social process mostly. So we know that people radicalize in contacts with others. Now, that could be happening online very well, but these people obviously would need to be embedded in these networks already. It's not just propaganda that they might be reading. So I would say, yes, there's a likelihood that COVID-19 is exacerbating the problems that were already there before, but still too early to tell exactly what is that impact going to look like.
And you picked up on the point of conspiracy theories there, which is something that's clearly becoming an increasing issue in the UK. And I wanted to ask Matthew whether there's a sense that conspiracy theories of the kind that we're seeing spreading through protests, such as anti-vaccination theories, New World Order kind of globalist conspiracy theories, should we see those as something that's part of a pre-existing phenomena that can play into left-wing, right-wing Islamist ideas, or is this something new, and how should we respond to these?
Thanks, Lizzie. I guess I'd answer in two ways. I mean, first, it's hard for me to think of right-wing extremism without recourse to conspiracy theories. So to some extent, it's part and parcel of right-wing extremism. And I think that that's an important place to start. So when we talk about other conspiracy theories, and it bears mentioning, I think the internet has speeded up a lot of this. A lot of people forget QAnon has only been around for 3 years now. And even though it didn't start out as a far-right conspiracy theory or an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, it seems to me that a lot of these things are sort of like lava coming down a volcano. They sort of fit into pre-existing grooves. And what we see with QAnon, for example, is the idea of a cabal of sort of controllers who are secretive, who are out there manipulating, very easily folds into existing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So There's plenty of, in a sense, non-extremist conspiracy theories that aren't perhaps hateful, that aren't necessarily rejections of pluralism. It might be that you think the aliens have come and, abducted your family or something like that, but at the same time, I think in the main, conspiracy theories can act as drivers of radicalization. And when we see at the other end, people who are, let's say, convicted for acts of political violence or terrorism, almost invariably, at least on the in terms of right-wing extremism, conspiracy theory is indeed part and parcel of that mindset.
Okay, very interesting stuff. And a question for you, Richard, if I may. One of the other big developments we've seen in recent days is the appeal, or the latest stage of the appeal, over Shamima Begum and her potential battle over her UK citizenship. That seems to have brought a lot of debates about the best way to deal with returning ISIS members and foreign terrorist fighters to the fore. And those questions really seem to be ongoing, not just in the UK, but internationally. What do you make of the government's decision to try and keep Shamima Begum and others like her out the country? And do you think that's sustainable going forward, seeing the kind of legal challenges that we are now seeing?
Well, of course, I did the national appeal when Shamima was a teenager, and we were trying desperately to keep her in the country, and strenuously made some strenuous attempts to try and get her back before she actually got into Syria. Sadly, that wasn't successful. I think we have to let the legal system and the legal process take its course and respect the view of the Supreme Court. She will present obviously a challenge if she does come back, a challenge in terms of security and potentially threat. I'm not privy to the information as to what, or the intelligence as to what she may or may not have done in Syria while she's been there, but clearly the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, believed that she was a threat to national security, which is why her citizenship was revoked. So we'll have to see whether the Supreme Court gives her, not gives her back citizenship, but whether it actually allows her to be present in the UK to make her appeal against that decision. But I think we have to respect the courts. And one of the parts of the definition of extremism, which is still current from the 2015 definition, is the rule of law. And so we have to demonstrate that we respect the rule of law. And obviously if the Supreme Court says she can return, then she will return, and the police will have to ensure that she's not the threat that there is concern that she is. And obviously that's a costly, expensive business. We don't know to what extent she has been de-radicalized in any sense. So, but the rule of law must be applied with, and that's why we're a liberal democracy, because we respect the rule of law, and we will do with that decision too.
Thank you. And a question for Osama. You brought up in your opening remarks the situation in France and the discussions being led there by Emmanuel Macron about the nature of politics, religion, secularism. That's sparking a lot of global debate. And in this country, we've also seen counter-terrorism and counter-extremism measures such as Prevent become a rallying force for Islamist groups. Do you have a sense of what appears to have worked, and is there a reason why France seems to be a kind of lone voice with taking the stance that it is, and do you have any idea where this discussion about how to handle Islamism, Islam and Islamist inspired terrorism is going?
Yeah, thank you. And there are a couple of questions in the chat asking about similar issues as well. So my view on that is, as I wrote for the Tony Blair Institute at the beginning of this year, actually, in my essay on deradicalisation, is that part of this is that modern nation states have to assert their basic values, and with a proviso that, of course, those national values must be universal and committed to human rights and not discriminate against others. For example, I'm thinking of the persecution of Uyghur Muslims and other groups in China in the name of a kind of central one China communist state, for example. So, a lot of the conflict is to do with the nature of modern nation states, because the Islamist extremism explicitly rejects modern nation states, and argues for an autocratic, theocratic caliphate run by God's law, run under Sharia. So these, or their interpretation of Sharia, should I say, rather than mainstream kind of moderate Muslim interpretations. So these issues, strike at the very core that nations need to know what their values are and recognize the threat from extremist groups such as Islamists and others. And of course, France does seem to be tackling that, and seems to be a lone voice actually, because perhaps it's the most strident in tackling it. And although I think actually, again, Britain has had one of the best and most balanced approaches to this, because the prevent duty has been around for a number of years, and the British government has talked about British values and given quite a good balanced definition or explanation of what those British values are. And as I said before, we do this here under a rubric of multiculturalism. And similarly in the US, where in many ways their founding principles are similar to those in France and kind of developed alongside them. But there's a lot more respect, if you like, and acceptance of the place of religion in society, in public, in the US, because large parts of the US are very religious, and you have American presidents referring to religion. In Britain, we have an established church and an interplay between the church and the state and the royal family, for example. So as I said before, I think we do these things very differently, whereas in France, they have a much more strident kind of approach to their Republican values. And I think one of the reasons they're having problems there is that the fundamental values there, which I agree with Professor Tariq Maudud, are common to all Western liberal democracies or liberal democracies: liberté, égalité, fraternité. There is always a tension between those three values, because, for example, there's a tension between liberty and fraternity. Fraternity is bringing society together and having common kind of cause, etc. And of course, some people will exploit liberty to cause offense or cause problems, or fight against community cohesion, if you like, break down community cohesion. And now it seems to me, for example, that tension is not adequately explored in France, where a lot of the emphasis over the last few years has been on liberty and less on equality and fraternity. Certainly from the point of view of Muslims in France, a very large population, maybe 10%. And when I talk to many kind of integrated professional French Muslims, they feel they're not part of the debate, if you like. It's the government talking at them, a government dominated by white middle class men. So I think they need to just include the Muslims more in the debate, actually, rather than talking at the Muslims, is to include them in the debate, as I think we've done in this country, actually, quite successfully since 9/11, since Mr. Tony Blair's reign. And we have Muslim background ministers, we have mayors up and down the country, and celebrities, all kinds of people. There is a lot more sense that Muslims feel included. When Jacques Straw said Islam is a mainstream religion, he was saying that. Now, of course, Macron is saying some of these things as well. So I think as you said, those debates in France, I think, will reverberate around the world, and different nations will have to work out their own way of doing it. As I said, I might be biased, but I do think the British solution is much better than the French one and the American one. And I would add that proviso that the nation state's values mustn't be oppressive themselves. And I think that's the danger that France may have in the way it interprets the laïcité or its fundamental values in terms of the place of religion, especially in the public space.
Thank you. So we are now going to move on to the audience Q&A. Thank you all so much for all the questions you've submitted already. How we're going to do it is I will say who the question is from, and then I'll unmute you to allow you to speak. So if at that point you wouldn't mind saying your name and who the question's directed to, and so we can get as many questions in as possible. If I could ask you to keep your questions brief, that would be fantastic, and we can hear as many as possible. So the first one is from Ben Smith, and you should be able to talk now. Thanks, Lizzie. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Thank you. Super. I'm Ben Smith, a counter-extremism practitioner based in the Midlands. A question could be answered by Richard, but it was really in reference
Sarah Khan and the Commission for Counter-Extremism's recommendations to government in their Hateful Extremism report in October 2019. Just keen to get the panel's views maybe on that report, but equally where the government might need to go in formally responding to it and what the new CE strategy could look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It's an interesting question. And I very much respect the Commission's work on this and Sarah Khan's work. They've done some great work over the last 12, 18 months or so. In terms of the definition of hateful extremism, I'm slightly hesitant, if I'm honest, about that definition. And I'd actually be interested in Isama's view on it as well, because I'm not, as I said in my opening piece, I have a concern that we're underplaying the role of ideology in extremism more broadly, whether it's Islamist extremism or other forms of extremism. And we're focusing on socioeconomic matters and profiles and other things. And we're, as a result, I think we're going to find it harder to resolve those extremist narratives if we don't address the ideology or the theology. And of course, Tony Blair himself has spoken about this many times. And when he was Prime Minister, stressed probably almost on his own the battle against ideologies. So if we label extremism as hateful extremism, I'm not entirely sure all extremism is actually hate inspired. It's a slightly moot point, but I don't know. Perhaps Zama could comment from his point of view.
Yeah, is that okay, Lizzie, if I just follow up quickly on that?
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Richard, for your thoughts on that. My understanding is that that Sarah Khan and the Commission there, they identified that there was a bit of a grey area in between extremism, which after all is legal because we can't police people's thoughts, etc. Obviously, violence is illegal, and also hate speech or certain types of hate speech are illegal. So the problem, actually, what you were talking about, the ideology, because many groups or individuals would take ideology, extreme ideology, and take people very close to violence, but do so legally because they weren't actually directly inciting violence, for example, but they were promoting extremist ideology. And then those people would be easy prey for radicalization by the actual terrorist groups. And to kind of bridge that gap, that kind of grey area in policy and legislation between extremist thought, or certainly speech, which is actually legal, versus what is illegal, which is obviously terrorism and violence, etc. But also hate speech or certain types are illegal. That the Commission came up with, which I think is a very good idea in terms of talking about hateful extremism, which really is the overlap, where people cannot use the defense, that they are just exercising their free speech. And extremism in a sense is relative. That's the kind of argument people give, is that this is their free speech, then they can say what they like, basically. But to help with the authorities to prosecute and to preserve community cohesion is to see where that falls into hate speech. That's my understanding of that proposal, really, in very general ways. And I think it's worth looking at. It will certainly be very interesting to see what the government response to it, as one of the questioners asked. And it will probably need a review of existing legislation in the area to see where that gap is and whether we could have legislation around hateful extremism which would fill that gap and kind of reduce the space available to extremists.
Thank you. So now we have a question from Alvito de Souza. Again, I'm going to unmute you, but if for some reason anyone can't speak, I'll read your question out on your behalf, so there's no pressure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Alvito de Souza. I'm in Kenya, and I work for the Tony Blair Institute here in Kenya. Now, my question is to all the panelists, in a sense, is this growing, what I call legitimization of populist rhetoric and politics, which has even got into governments, as we see now. To what extent does this either feed or how does it push extremism when populist rhetoric and sometimes even denial of science and populist rhetoric is legitimized or becomes regular?
Excellent. So I will put that over to Matthew first, because I know that for one thing, you've been keeping an extremely close eye on developments in the US, where I'm sure we've all been watching the development of populism. So do you have any thoughts on that, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, populism is one of those areas that's, again, you know, academics will have different definitions. A lot of times it's the people who are seen as monolithic and pure against kind of corrupt elites and so forth. So it's usually understood in a kind of exclusive sense that populism excludes some people. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And of course, there are forms of populism that aren't just right-wing populism. But I think that it can, again, act as a radicalizer. And what we can see from the US example, although certainly not alone, is that you know, bad examples from the top can also fan the flames of right-wing extremism. And I think that we have seen that with Donald Trump. I would, maybe before I say this and put the cat amongst the pigeons here a little bit, I would suggest that most of our understandings of extremism is that it's somehow against or outside of the mainstream. And again, for most ports, that's fine. That's a normal understanding. But there can be cases when people have political power and engage in forms of extremism or extremist dialogue. And it's hard not to look at some of the things that Donald Trump says on Twitter and not think, if that was another person just saying that, we would quite happily characterize that person, who happens to be the president of the United States, as an extremist. And I think that that's one of the problems that we have, really, is that right-wing extremism can take these kinds of nods and winks that we see from, in this case, Donald Trump, and can really make hay with it. And one of my concerns about the US election, and I think we have to say, thankfully, that there wasn't violence around the election. A lot of the worst predictions, including concerns by me, haven't yet panned out. But I think that one of the concerns that we see from that kind of exclusionary populism is that it can very quickly radicalize a base. And I think that that's one of the elements that we see concerning in this kind of toxic mix of conspiracism, right-wing populism, and increasing, or at least it looks like, increasing forms of right-wing extremism making its way into the mainstream.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Sean Thompson. If you wouldn't mind saying your question and who it's for, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, Lizzie. Yeah, so Sean Thompson, Prevent Coordinator for Walton Forest. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so I mean, it's for everybody really, but Osama, you mentioned some of the work that you do in prisons and speaking to people that have been through that particular sector. And I'm just really interested to know what people's view are on the sort of risk and threat that is posed by that particular space, in the sense of individuals being exposed to radical ideas, the apparent lack of support that's available there, and obviously the connection to recent attacks that have occurred where people have been through supposed sort of disengagement programs but have then gone on to carry out attacks. So any insight and views from the panel around what kind of risk they believe sit in that space and what we might be able to do to tackle it?
Osama, would you like to start off on that one?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for that question. So Ian Aitchison, of course, did a report into prison radicalisation a couple of years ago, which was commissioned by the UK government, and he said it was quite alarming, actually, the extent of radicalisation in prison. And of course, those three of the Islamist terrorist attacks about a year ago in quick succession were all carried out by prisoners, those on licence or very recently released. And many in the public after those attacks said, well, let's scrap these prison DRAD programs because they're clearly not working. Whereas I believe actually the opposite is true. The separation centres and the desistance and disengagement programs in prison have actually had a lot of successes that we don't hear about so much, and they don't grab the headlines in the same way. So I think actually those programs need more investment and more support to learn from the lessons of those attacks last year, to try to stop those happening again. I'm confident that can be done, rather than scrap those kinds of programs in prison, which would lead to the problem getting bigger and even more out of control or worse.
And Richard, would you like to comment on those at all? Because we broadly, the trend that we had in 2017 is what was called unknown knowns, in the sense that they were people who had appeared on the radar, but people weren't quite sure what they were planning. Now we have a phenomenon where, like it's been alluded to, we have known terror offenders while under monitoring managing to plan and execute attacks. You know, what do you think's changed there, and what do you think needs to be done now?
Well, I agree we need to invest more in de-radicalisation programs in prisons. I don't think we've scratched the surface yet. I mean, there is some success, as Emma says, but I think we've got a long way to go. We've obviously, from my perspective, we've been very successful in frankly filling the prisons with those plotting terrorist attacks, and so, but they haven't always received long sentences. And that's partly because of the nature of the operations against these individuals, and because we were interdicting proactively and sometimes covertly for lesser offences in the early stages of their plotting, if you like, then they go to prison for less time frames than they would have done if they'd been successful in carrying out the attack. So hence the sentences are lower, and then they're obviously coming out of prison. So we need to acknowledge that most terrorist prisoners will be released, the vast majority will be released at some point. So therefore we have to do a lot more to work hard to get them so that they're safe when they're released. And I think 3 or 4 terrorist attacks in the last year or two is just simply not acceptable. We can't accept that as a new norm. There's a lot more to be done. And to be honest, I mean, the report that was done by NHS, I think, had a lot of merit, to be honest. It's a very, very difficult area, let's be honest, though. There's been little success, particularly against ISIS, you know, the ISIS ideologues, if you like. There was more success against Al-Qaeda individuals to de-radicalize them, but I've seen very little success anywhere in Europe or indeed in the world on de-radicalizing those individuals. So there's much more to be done.
Thank you. So we now have a question from Rory McLeod, and unfortunately we do only have 5 minutes left. So if I could ask everyone to keep things as snappy as possible, that would give us time for as many questions as possible. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for a really interesting discussion. Richard, I can see you've already answered this in part in the chat, in case you wanted to expand. So we're now almost 1 year on to the day from Lord Carlisle's removal as the lead on the independent review of Prevent, and the government is still yet to appoint a replacement. What do you make of the delay? And I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Richard, would you like to start on that one?
Just briefly, as I said in the chat, obviously it's regrettable having commissioned the Prevent review that has not started yet. We need to get that started and activated, so we need an appointment very soon. I believe the government have got that in hand, and I think Christina's going to come in, so I'll let Christina do it.
Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
I was just going to add on that one problem that Prevent is constantly accused of is being opaque, being not transparent. Even, of course, we've all seen the accusations of being discriminatory. And I think the fact that this review keeps getting delayed is just not doing it any favors, because that is just a perfect opportunity to really have a close look at all those accusations and all the effectiveness of Prevent as a strategy as well. And really, I think this, of course, we've got the COVID pandemic and things are being delayed anyway. But I think it's one thing that in our research and that when we were asking focus groups, well, what makes you trust your counter-terrorism policy? Part of it was transparency and knowing what's happening. And I think that the fact that this keeps being pushed and it's not, we don't really know, you know, the next who's going to be appointed and so on, it's just not contributing to its effectiveness at all.
Okay, thank you very much. So our next question is going to be from Wasik, and you are able to go ahead now.
Oh, hi there. This is just a question for Osama. Do you think the culture of these groups helps to maintain them should a significant figure, a leading figure from these groups be taken out either through death or through, you know, just being disassociated with the cause or anything like that? So do you think the culture within the groups helps to maintain and endure them as groups?
Well, thank you for that. So certainly charismatic leaders obviously have an impact, but I think we should remember that we can disrupt their activities and their influence by taking them out of circulation, by imprisoning them, for example, when they've committed a crime. A good example of that is Anjem Choudhury, although he's out on license now. And once his license conditions expire, it will be interesting to see how active he becomes. And my guess is he will continue to try to incite attacks like he did in the past, while claiming that he's still operating within the law, because obviously many of his close associates have become terrorists and carried out horrific crimes or gone abroad to do so. But another example is on the far right, with Tommy Robertson, for example, and this is where civil society can really help. The fact that he was banned from Twitter and I believe Facebook as well, did decrease his visibility, certainly amongst, if you like, the mainstream public, where he was highly visible before. I think he's kind of almost disappeared from the national consciousness over the last year or so, although he's clearly still trying. He was arrested at Hyde Park a couple of weeks ago for organizing a protest to do with Muslims and Islamist extremists as before. So the charismatic leaders are always going to be a rallying point and cry, and they're going to have that influence. But we can discredit them and we can discredit their ideas as well. Especially, I think Anjem Choudhury used to be Al Qaeda, then he became ISIS, and as I said before, ISIS had become highly discredited in terms of their ideas and certainly in terms of their military defeat, which proves that they're not supported by God, if you like, and a lot of people can see that. So I think we need to keep that pressure up actually, and not be afraid of those people. One of my colleagues has called for a public debate, more public debates between Muslim imams or other leaders and Anjem Choudhury, for example. And that might be a good idea if it's handled in the right way.
So I'm afraid it is now 5 o'clock and we are sadly out of time for the questions, but thank you so much to all our panelists for joining the discussion, and thank you to all the attendees. I hope that not only did you find some interesting points in the webinar, but also in the chat. And thank you so much for participating and your really interesting thoughts. And with that, we are going to sign off. Thanks very much.